Good morning and welcome to our weekly Bible study. As you know by now, we are doing a study on faith and healing. So far, we've talked about wellness and we've also talked about healing and what those words may or may not mean to us. Well, it seems to me like the next thing we need to discuss then is illness. What is it that we need healing from, and what form would that healing take? Uh, it's important that we understand that God is a witness to our situation, whatever that situation may be. And so, as you know, Psalm 23 is probably the most significant and most well known uh, passage in the Bible for the Jewish faith as well as the Christian faith. It is read almost every year during the lectionary year. It is also in almost every funeral. Almost every funeral I do, uh, Psalm 23 is requested, and that's for good reason. It has very significant meaning to us. The words are filled with comfort. But with that said, I want us to look today at Psalm 22, the psalm right before it. With any passage of the Bible you read, you always want to read what was before it and what was after it. Now, each psalm is actually individually its own little story, its own piece of poetry. That said, there was an editor that put these in order of a certain kind. It wasn't like they just threw all the psalms in the air, and wherever they landed, that's the order they were put in. No, there was a very uh, thought out process of which psalm goes where. And so, with that in mind, right before Psalm 23, we have these words, and I'm reading out of the New Living Bible today. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why do you remain so distant? Why do you ignore my cries for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night you hear my voice, but I find no relief. Yet you are holy. The praise of Israel surrounds your throne. Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. You heard their cries for help and saved them. They put their trust in you and were never disappointed. But I am a worm and not a man. I am scorned and despised by all. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads, saying, "Is this the one who relies on the Lord?" Now, right here, David starts using different terminology. At this time, he's been using a root form of El for God. My God, oh El, why have you forsaken me? This is the father of gods at that time. And El is one of our root names for God throughout the Old Testament. But here, at this stage in verse 8, he goes to Lord. Now, in an English translation, anytime you see the word Lord written in all caps, Lord in all caps, that is code for Yahweh, or the formal name of God, the name that was given to Abraham and also to Jacob. So this is a very important thing. He's now going to a different form of name and going to a lot more formal name. So he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he says, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Yahweh, not just any God, but you. Why are you there? And so we find these words. This is the one who relies on the Lord. And that's a question, actually. I said it as a statement, but it was a question. This is the one who relies on the Lord. This is the one who's relying on Yahweh. Look at his situation. Then let the Lord save him. And this also refers back for us in the Christian faith to when Jesus is on the cross and the leaders of the Jewish community are saying, he saved so many others, let him save himself. So that's actually an allusion in the New Testament back to this passage. If the Lord loves him so much, let the Lord rescue him. Yet you brought me out of safety from my mother's womb and led me to trust you when I was a nursing infant. I was thrust upon you at my birth. You have been my God from the moment I was born. Do not stay so far from me, for trouble is near. And it actually goes on for quite a few more verses. There's 31 verses in it. A beautiful passage filled with angst and anguish and pain. Here recently, I have been doing funerals, not so much for our own church community, but for the greater community. There's obviously lots of folk who, at this time, are needing spiritual, not so much guidance, but as I guess the best word would be Sherpa. I'm going there as their spiritual guide through a journey that they're having to take. And ironically, these have all been 80 and 90-year-old people who are passing away. They've lived good lives. They've lived through some rather incredible times, whether it be the World War II, the Korean crisis, the Cold War, Vietnam. They have gone through recessions. They have gone through booms. They have gone through all these different things. But now we're seeing something that we have not seen in a couple of generations. We have not had a epidemic like this since 1919, really. And this is the first time we've ever dealt with illness in this format, with a 24-hour news cycle, or with the amount of science involved. We now know how this all happened. Actually, many years ago, before all this was done, something that happened that was a real huge move as far as health. We had a epidemic run through the country, and one of the things that they figured out was that all these public spittoons were making people sick. You'd be chewing your tobacco or just wanting to spit, and they would have these brass spittoons. You've seen them all over the place. You don't see them as much anymore as when I was a kid, or at least where I grew up. Spittoons, I mean, some people still even used them in their own home. But the point was is that we figured out that all that saliva and all that filth and all that gunk, also just sitting out there in the sun or in a hot room, was just a petri dish waiting to happen. And so all of a sudden, overnight, they made the edict, you will no longer do this. We're not going to have you spitting in public. We're not going to have spittoons for you anymore. If you want your tobacco, that's your business, but you're not going to spit in the lobby. And so they got rid of spittoons. And all of a sudden, they saw a decrease in the disease and sickness in the communities. So that's one of those places where some science came in well before now, and they started figuring out, hey, we can't do this. One of the things they're talking about right now, which I'm not in favor of because of my role as a minister, is they're actually saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't shake hands anymore. Growing up in the South as I did, and growing up in the ministry as I did, you always shake hands with everybody. If someone offers you their hand, you shake it, period. It's part of being a polite society. Now, I have a problem with us saying we're not going to shake hands anymore. But then I started thinking about, well, where did the custom of shaking hands come from? And it actually comes back from the days when you would offer your dominant hand to the person that you were meeting so that they could feel your forearm and see that you weren't holding a concealed weapon. That was the whole point. And you were feeling their arm, making sure they didn't have a concealed weapon. So this thing of honor and glory and polite civilization that we have really was brought out of necessity again when we were trying to live a little bit safer, and where we were saying, hey, we don't want this. We don't want to feel threatened while we're talking to you. And so we came up with shaking hands. Illness can come in many different forms, and right now we especially want to be very mindful that illness is striking us in many different ways. Illness is striking us economically. There are literally millions of people right now, the greatest number of unemployment we've had since the Depression. And really, even the Depression, we cannot fathom as today because there's so many more of us. We now have 330 million people who live in this country. That said, when you have 14% unemployment, that's significant. Um, so we have people who are very ill economically. We have a number of folk who are very ill physically. We've lost over 80,000 people to one disease this year. Now, that's not counting all the other diseases and all the other things that have happened. Once again, I'm doing at least one funeral a week right now, and none of them have been dealt with the coronavirus. They have been other things. So we have to understand that there are diseases out there that are affecting us physically, viruses, uh, bacteria, uh, cancer, you name it. There are all kinds of things that make us sick. That said, there's also those things that are making us emotionally and physically and spiritually sick, such as the isolation, such as not being around people, such as not being able to do what you want. Actually, another place David talks about, actually, it's a not David. David talks about it a little bit himself, but the passage I'm thinking about is actually when Jesus is talking to Peter, and he is telling Peter, one of these days you're going to have to go where you do not want to go. People are going to lead you a direction that you don't want. And he's actually predicting Peter's death. And it's a tough thing to hear, but it's also dealing with the reality that sometimes we go places we don't want to go, whether that's not being able to eat at the restaurant we want, or not being able to work where we want, or not being able to go where we want. We have all these different things that weigh down on us and create illness in some form. We're starting to see an uptick in suicide, both from medical professionals who are overwhelmed and from other people who are dealing with other issues in their lives that they never thought they were going to deal with. And so we had to start realizing that we're sick before we can actually be healed. That's one of the things that we see in Psalm 22. David is acknowledging his brokenness, his weakness, his illness. When we start acknowledging our spiritual illness, when we start acknowledging our physical illness, when we start acknowledging all these diseases that take many different forms in our life, then all of a sudden we can start also calling for the help that we need, whether it be physical, spiritual. God answers prayer in many different ways. A lot of times the prayer is answered in a way that you least expected. And that's part of the problem sometimes we have, is that we very much wanted God to answer the prayer the way we wanted it answered. And yet God answers it the way that God feels we need it answered. So as we start talking more about healing and miracles and wellness, we also have to acknowledge that we are ill, and that this illness is has got some pretty deep roots that have to be dug out and cut out in many different forms. A lot of cancer, you start either with chemotherapy, then surgery, and then radiation, or some kind of combination of that. It's never usually just one thing. And that's what we're going to find in this situation right now, too. There's not going to be one form of healing. There's going to be many different kinds of healing. And one of the best healing things that we can all do for one another right now is how we share God's love, mercy, and patience. Faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Let's pray. Gracious God, we do thank you for this time together. We thank you for a chance to just think about your word and how it is a light unto our feet and a lamp unto our path. We pray that you will help us find the journey that we need to be on right now, and that as we walk through the tangled web of this life, that we will always hear your voice in all that we do. We ask these things humbly in your name. Amen. Go in God, go in peace.